I have been accused of a laundry list of heinous crimes. Of course, all of them attempted. Normally, I succeed in what I do. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode number 12 in season 3, and we are continuing our discussion of cults. So, before we get started, this is our third episode on cults. So, our first one in the series, we talked a little bit about why cults scare us and what cults are, the different interpretations we may have of cults. In our second episode, Lisa and I talked a bit about fictional cults. We focused on the cult of Cthulhu and Lovecraftian cults, and we talked about the movie The Endless. In this episode, we are going to be talking about cults in real life. And particularly, we're going to talk about documentaries that came out in the last few years about different cults. And we're for sure going to talk about Wild Wild Country. And I imagine it will probably take up a lot of our time. Apparently, the last couple years were pretty big for people talking about, writing about, making cult movies and documentaries. So we thought instead of just focusing on fiction, we might open it up to documentaries and look at the real life horror of these sorts of communes that sometimes can turn in very disturbing ways. So our opening quote was from, if you've been watching Wild Wild Country, if you watched it when it came on Netflix last year, you've watched it lately, you know probably that the opening quote comes from Ma Nan Sheela, kind of the second in command of the Rajneeshis. The branch of the Sannyasin group that started in India and ultimately started gaining traction in the West and ended up moving to a compound in Oregon in the late 70s and early 80s. And the documentary Wild Wild Country, which is a 6-part series, covers kind of the history of the group when they were in India, and then why they moved to Oregon, and then how things soured rather quickly with their neighbors of the small town of Antelope, Oregon. And they kind of go back and forth, and some really disturbing things happen after that within the cult, but also within the group, but also between the group and the townspeople nearby. And this is a group that still continues even today, even though the leader, I believe, died in the late 80s or early 90s, but there still are groups across the world. So this is one of those groups that we're talking about that is not only real and has a historical aspect that maybe some people don't know about, but is still continuing. So Lisa, Matt, I know all three of us have I think all three of us have been watching it. Maybe we all haven't watched all 6 parts, but how do you guys, what do you guys think of it, the documentary and what happened and how it kind of relates to what we've been talking about these last couple weeks?
I guess I'll start off because I think that you and Lisa will be doing the bulk of the discussion because I have not finished the documentary yet. I had actually only just heard of it when one of you two brought it up in our planning for this particular episode, and so I don't know how I missed it when it first came out on Netflix, but it's a doozy so far. Like it'll suck you in, and I think it was Lisa who had said that just when you think it can't get crazier, it gets crazier. And yeah, I'm only like halfway through. I think I'm on episode 3 of the 6, and it's definitely interesting to see this cult that I had no knowledge of before. I'd never heard of any of these events before I started watching this, and so I wasn't aware of any of it. Not like something big like Jonestown or the Branch Davidians. I don't know how I never heard of them, but yeah, very interesting. And what's kind of scary to me is how I feel like I'm the kind of person that might have gotten sucked into this particular cult because of its focus on like meditation, and a lot of the things that its leaders said were things that I'm like, yeah, I kind of agree with him on a lot of things, but that would have been at the beginning and not when they got crazier and crazier. So but yeah, definitely for those of you who haven't seen it, go watch this episode or this documentary on Netflix. It's definitely worth it.
Yeah, this is an odd topic really to kind of discuss because normally when we're talking about horror and the different facets of things, we're usually talking about it in either a really abstract way or we're talking about it in a very fictional way. And I can't think really. We haven't done too many just episodes solely devoted to documentaries. And it's weird watching it because you're right, Matt, when you say just when you think it can't get any stranger, it does. Um, Wild Wild Country, and I will just apologize because if you haven't watched any of the episodes, we're gonna spoil some of it for you for you here. Um, but Matt, I was like you. I had not heard anything about this group before I started watching. And I don't know if it's because when all of this was happening, I was a really young child. So maybe it was on the news and it just didn't register for me because I wasn't watching the news at the time. I don't know if it's because it happened up in Oregon and I grew up in the South. And so I don't know if it's just the proximity. But one thing, and I'm sorry, this is going to sound a bit rambling, so just stick with me here for a minute, guys. One thing that I find especially fascinating about cults, whether they're fictional cults or documentaries about real cults, is the us versus them um, mentality that forms around this. And we've talked about this in our past episodes, that we kind of look at these groups and we think, how did you get involved with this, right? And Matt, it's like you said, well, when you start watching this, you think that's something I could have been a part of, or that's something I can see that I would have wanted to be a part of, even as they were forming their initial, um, I don't know what you want to call it, commune, maybe would be the best word, or when they were forming their group home, basically in Oregon. It seemed like a very pleasant place. And they spend a lot of time in the documentary talking about how their community is being formed and what they wanted to do. And one thing that I was really struck by is how they wanted, it seemed, to revitalize community because they talked about at one point planting all the food, right? And they basically took this land that had not been used to grow anything for a long time and made it productive again. And so you get this kind of hippie-ish commune community where everything is about love and peace and equality and they want everybody's spiritual health to be great, so there's this focus on like meditation, and it almost seems like a really great like health retreat almost for a while. But then the tone changes so very quickly. And I don't know, because I don't want to wade too deep into the craziness of it quickly. So maybe we just like pause there and talk a little bit about how they were forming the community. And Matt, I'm curious when you said um, that it's something that you could have seen yourself possibly being at least interested in. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that before we dive into the crazy things.
Um, I mean, I think it's just sort of the overall ideals that they sort of prescribed to. I mean, this is something that's growing out of the 60s and free love. I don't think that they started in the 60s, if I'm remembering correctly, but the mentality definitely filtered over into the beginnings of the Rajneeshis. And I don't know, I mean, I've always been interested in Eastern religions, and like I consider myself to be, I guess I'll out myself, I'm a Buddhist. So there's just something, a lot of what Rajneeshi was preaching, and I use the word preaching lightly because he wasn't preaching, well, I mean, he was, but I guess it's his idea that really, like, that there is no one true religion, and let's just take the things that work and use these things for you. I mean, I'm kind of filtering what he'd said kind of into my own words there, but like that was the intriguing part. Like, he wasn't claiming to be some sort of, the reincarnation of Buddha or the second coming of Jesus. He never claimed any of that authority, at least not as far as I've seen. I can't speak to the second half of the, maybe he goes off the rails and suddenly turns all messianic, but at least in the beginning, which is when I would have probably been drawn in if I were to have gotten drawn in, he wasn't that kind of person. He was just an enlightened teacher who'd studied a lot of philosophy and a lot of religion and kind of put together some stuff that seemed kind of cool and very much like love each other, be cool to each other, like the basics of most religions. And I think those are the ideas that I was kind of drawn to in what he was saying. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely does. And I can see that because he doesn't at first hit a lot of those things that would warn you about, oh, this is a cult leader, right? Because at first it does seem like he is all about just, well, let's move towards enlightenment, but leave the trappings of religion behind. Let's have a sense of equality among people and try to get rid of the trappings of society that can hold certain people back. Really, really interesting. And what I find fascinating about this is when he did make the move to come to Oregon, because that seems to be when things switched. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit because I think it's relevant to our discussion of cults, and that when he first started teaching, I think if he had kept a small number of followers, it may not have been what it became, and it may not have been the problematic cult that it became. The problem is he, I guess, gained so many followers and so many people who were wanting to come and listen to his teachings that he needed more space, basically, if I'm remembering this right. It's been a while since I watched the documentary in its entirety. But so that's why they chose Oregon, because, they were basically like, well, here's this land that we can kind of build. I don't know if they ever used the word like utopia, but it was kind of that idea of they can build their perfect place where people can come and not only listen to what he was talking about, but also really try to live it out, to be free of all those things in society and traditional religion that hold people back. And so that's why they came here. And what I find, and maybe we're just going to have to jump into talking about it, because it seems to me that it wasn't just that they had this charismatic leader, but more of the people who came to power with him, who then took control of things, and what happened when they got to Oregon. And this is one of the things that basically I found so troublesome immediately about this, is you had these people in this very small town of Antelope. It was Antelope, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. In Antelope, Oregon, who I guess, I mean, they were your typical like small town, people, they lived there their whole lives. They weren't used to a whole lot of change. And suddenly thousands of people come and set up this new like society basically outside of it. At first it was like just outside of their city limits, I think, or in a small portion of their town limits. But they were obviously like, who are these people? I mean, I don't know what I would equate that to now, because I can't imagine somebody just like this whole group of people coming in mass and suddenly like just setting roots down in your town. The problem was when they started basically moving into a town takeover, right? first by buying property up and pushing different people out of holding political power. And that was when it became a really interesting documentary for me because it pushed that us versus them dichotomy that I find so fascinating when you're looking at kind of cults or fringe groups. Really pushed it to a head because here you had these people who had been living in this town forever and wanted to keep it the town that they knew. But then you had this other group coming in and they were changing things. And part of me thought, well, is that really so bad? Like, if what they're doing is good, which it seemed to be at the beginning, if what they're doing is good, then don't they have as much right as anybody else to come and, for instance, participate in town politics or, to buy property? Like, so I had this weird. I don't even know if I can still describe how I felt watching that because I almost didn't know who was in the right there because I could see both sides of it.
Yeah, I agree at the beginning. And I mean, that's the thing with the documentary too, is you're being filtered through different viewpoints because you're just getting interviews with people. But yeah, in the beginning, they decide they're going to go to Oregon. And I mean, they know they have thousands of people, so they buy like this ranch has like hundreds and hundreds of acres, right? Like they're not even bothering Antelope other than the fact that they have to come through in their vans to even get to this ranch. Um, and so at first I was kind of like, well, this is a really tiny town, it has less than 50 people in it. And they've had things the same for a long period of time. And this is change and it's outsiders. And it's also not just outsiders, but it's some people from, other countries. And they may be noisy and they're building a city. I mean, they spent, thousands, millions of dollars literally building a city in the middle of that place and reclaiming the land and all this stuff. And I'm like, cool, they're, raising food and bringing this area back to life. But yeah, the us versus them seems to cut both ways here. The small town is pissed off that they're coming in and doing all this stuff and messing up the status quo, and they're outsiders, and they start getting angry about it and kind of showing unfriendly or unneighborly behavior, watching them. Of course, there are weapons involved. And then the group seems to start to expand their power, which is one of their issues they were having that caused them to move to Oregon. I mean, they had a ton of Rolls Royces and were like rock stars right before they came to Oregon. And then it just expanded in that case. So it seemed like to me that both sides have this like insider outsider thing going. And then the commune, the longer it goes, they couch what they're doing in a defense against the small towns people, but actually it becomes more and more offensive as power struggles start becoming more apparent in the commune, if that makes sense. It seemed like to me that there was kind of a switch. It's like it's always about the people outside, but the expansion and all these things they're doing is also very much related to all these struggles that Bhagwan is having. Even though he's not speaking, he took his vow of silence or whatever at that point, so we don't even know what he was thinking between him and his second in command, Sheila, who was the person speaking, for them on TV and everything. And so, I don't know, there was this weird kind of us versus them, but also the power issues that are going on in the commune that not everybody in the commune could know about. And all of that just seemed to be incendiary. Like all of that together seemed to be what kind of escalated it so quickly, as I think all three of us have said. It just seems to go up very quickly.
Well, it does, and I think that kind of hits the nail on the head, Mel, about what makes cults so terrifying and fascinating at the same time. Because with something like this, when you watch it, you do think, okay, I could see how I would want to be part of this group. Even though, they do some things that seem a little bit strange, like we haven't even mentioned, but the wearing all red or kind of this like orangish red. They all kind of dance alike. And then part of his, like, I guess, meditative teaching is he almost whips people up into kind of like a frenzy. And, there's a lot of sex with a lot of different people involved. And, I mean, it does kind of follow along with that whole like 70s free love type mentality. It doesn't surprise me that this is when, he rose to popularity, kind of pulling on those cultural touchstones, I guess. But as you're watching this, you're thinking, okay, this isn't so bad. And Mel, like you said, maybe not everybody was privy to what was happening, um, as they went on the offensive. I think that's a good word for it. Because at first they were just defending their rights to be there, to be in Oregon, as people kind of got upset that they were even there. And then they started going on the offensive, saying, no, we're gonna protect our land. We're gonna protect our people. But you could see how, if you were on the inside of that, if this was a way of life that you were really committed to and you felt like that you had every legal right to be there, um, how quickly they would be like, no, well, we'll take up arms if it means defending that. If it means defending our way of life and our freedom to live the way we want, then we'll take up arms to do that. And that was one thing that struck me as really fascinating as I was watching this, is the links that they were willing to go to, in that kind of battle between. I mean, I see this, and this is what blows my mind, that I didn't know about it for so long until I watched this documentaries. I'm like, this was like a mini civil war happening in rural Oregon in the 80s, like during my lifetime, that I didn't know about. That's what blows my mind.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even like we were kids at the time, so maybe we didn't notice on the news. It's kind of weird that we just haven't heard about it, period, right? Because I mean,
Right.
it's like we all know about Jonestown, but we weren't necessarily like watching, 60 Minutes all the time at that point, like, what age we were at the time. But this is like, and I don't know if maybe it's because it didn't go that far. Like people, I mean, it went pretty far and it was pretty horrible and it was very scary. But
wait a minute.
people survived. And I'm just wondering if it was the fact that the big fatal conflagration they thought was going to happen and they were so scared of didn't happen, that, not to say that crazy things didn't happen. I mean, people bombed the Rajneeshis hotel they were running in Portland to create income. That's when they started arming themselves. Before that, they had tried to take over, the town of Antelope, and they changed its name and all the, I mean, political struggles and everything else. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I just wonder if the fact that the ending happened the way it did is maybe why we didn't hear about it.
I mean, for me, and maybe you're right. I think we learn about places like Jonestown and, maybe even the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, because we learn about those because they usually came, like you said, to one kind of big dramatic head, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would not hear about Jonestown had Jonestown not ended with basically a mass murder suicide. We would not still be talking about David Koresh and the Branch Davidians had there not been a massive shootout at the end. And so maybe that's why, because it's much easier to talk about something when it's just one event and you look at it and you're like, well, we were obviously right and they were obviously wrong. And I think when you watch Wild Wild Country, one of the things, I mean, besides just, if you're anything like me, constantly yelling at the TV going, what? Even more than that is how the Rajneeshis live in the gray area. Because like you said, they're not the only, it's not like they just took up guns and decided, well, we're taking over this town, which I think had it been something like that, where they just marched in like an army and took over this little Oregon town, we probably would have heard about it. But the way they did it was at first completely legally, by buying up property, by running. The one episode where they talk about running for politics, and you see the townspeople trying to fight it because they want to hold on to the majority rule over this one town, and you see the number of people walking in to cast ballots all dressed in red, and you realize just by sheer numbers they can vote whoever in they want to vote. And that's terrifying. Because I think we know, not going to get into modern politics, but we know how scary it can be when somebody you don't want in power suddenly is voted into power. And I think that was what the citizens of Antelope were kind of dealing with at that point. So it's this weird like gray area of like, well, they're doing it completely legally. They're embracing and that was part of the reason they talk about, we won't go into it, but they talk about why they picked Oregon and the United States in particular to move when they left India, was partly because of the laws and the freedom to, exercise religious beliefs and that sort of thing. But but then you see how quickly it escalates with like Mel, you mentioned the bombing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The bombing in the hotel, and it's heartbreaking. And then that's really when things they start to take up arms. And we're gonna go ahead and spoil it, but they fight back in really kind of insidious ways, and nobody really, like you said, it's not a big like dramatic movie moment murder or anything like that, but they did engage in basically what was like biological warfare when they at least we think that they basically caused food poisoning by poisoning some of the food supply in the town.
And the neighboring town, the county seat, because
Right.
they were trying to gain seats in the county political scene as well.
Yeah, I mean, so it does cross over into some territory that where you're just like, that's not okay. But I mean, it pretty much was a full scale war tactics going on in this county in Oregon.
Yeah, and the thing that kind of got to me is that you see, like, I think when you said they operate in a gray area, that is like, that's when I was just like, my brain was like, yes, like the whole movie I'm thinking this is so like amoral, right? I mean, some of the things that Sheila is saying in the interviews is like, whoa, like there's absolutely no empathy here. It's all like what I can do to like outmaneuver these people. And it doesn't matter what I have to do, I'll do it. It doesn't even matter if we're going against our own teachings because we have to protect, according to them, ourselves and the Bhagwan at all costs, right? And so it's like they can go from being relatively nonviolent to, well, we're plotting assassinations because we need to protect ourselves. We are plotting biological warfare and making a whole bunch of people sick and making other germs and bacteria and various other things because we're trying to protect ourselves. We're trying to poison people's water supply because we're trying to protect ourselves. And it's like, in my mind, I'm like, how is this happening? So yeah, I don't know. I mean, they start out as like we're this kind of philosophical mix with psychoanalysis, and we're helping you understand yourself. And now you have a family, and it's kind of like Hotel California. And once you check in, we're not sure if you'll be able to leave. And you're all wearing the same color, and you all have this man's picture around your neck. But we're not a cult. And then we start trying to kind of take over political power, and then we decide we have to protect ourselves with automatic weapons. I'm like, where does it end? And it just broke my heart with the one woman who had been chosen for a couple of the assassinations, because at one point she volunteered, and I don't know. I'm not using like the word brainwashing per se, but what she was describing was like she had bought into this so much, and she had no connection to like her family outside of it, just her kids inside, that it's like this the rationalizations that are going on within this group start to kind of like push people to do things that they even know are wrong, um, because they've like bought into it. Like, I don't, it's kind of like a groupthink kind of thing. It's like, we are all the same. We are all a family. We must protect ourselves. Even if that means like picking, creating this homeless group of homeless people that we claim we're going to take care of, but we're actually not. We're just using them to get more votes, or all the things that they do. Like, the ends justify the means. And I feel like innocent people are kind of being pushed in really nefarious ways to feel like these things are their only choice. Because if you're growing up, if you join this at a very vulnerable time in your life and this is all you know, it's kind of insidious, I think, in how it could actually get into your head. And the leaders are on their power trips, like trying to get more money and diamonds or whatever, and then struggle, an epic struggle. And it's all those folks who are just trying to live the life who seem, to me at least, to get pulled into these really nefarious and insidious plots. I feel like the cults that we talked about in the past, like it was just kind of creating the groundwork to get those people to do whatever they were told.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I still don't know what to make of this. It's probably a documentary I need to revisit at some point. But Mel, you brought up something that I do want to say before we finish up, I guess, our discussion on this, is that one of the things that this documentary does really well is not just present what happened and both sides, I think, of it. And as you mentioned, it does it through interviews. But what I found really compelling and kind of that added, I think, the human element was interviewing the people who had been part of the group at the time. And it seems to me that a lot of them had left at some point. But and they were from all over. There were some from America that had kind of joined when they got here. There were some, there was like, some Australians, people from all over the place um that they had interviewed who had been part of this. And it was really um it added a very unique human element to the story to try to understand what was happening, because I think had you just followed the leaders, because Sheila, we've kind of talked around her quite a bit. She was like I guess the second in command, basically. Arguably the one in control of a lot of the questionable tactics going on. She was certainly the public voice of the group, and because of her, I think, outgoing and kind of irreverent personality, I think I mentioned before there was one interview that she gave where, she was talking about how, people were questioning if it was okay that they were taking over the town, and she just basically said tough titties and moved on. That was just kind of her personality, and she made for a very, very entertaining leader to watch. And I think if we had just focused on her and Bhagwan, I think he goes by several different names throughout the course of
Yeah,
it. It
he
was a little
does.
confusing.
Yeah, now he's known as Osho. So
Osho,
the
right,
Osho group is the same thing. Yeah.
right. I think if we just focused on Osho and Sheila, it would have been a very different documentary. But it does a really good job at putting the focus on the followers who maybe didn't have as much power, and who were involved for different reasons, and I really appreciated that part of it.
Yeah, I did too. And even the people who still are into it and it didn't change their minds, the ones who didn't leave, I thought it was interesting to see their perspective. I mean, they maybe didn't know precisely what was going on at the top. And I think, like I was saying earlier, or was trying to say earlier, I think you could join this group for the right reasons and stay. I mean, you got thousands of people; they're not going to know what's going on to a certain extent. And so I thought it was interesting to see the people who really seemed to get something out of it, But I mean, talk about horror. One thing that I think needs to be mentioned is the fight between Bhagwan, Osho, and Sheila when she left, and it kind of fractured everything. I thought that was interesting because it kind of showed what was developing the whole time, what was actually going on between the two of them and this kind of ego contest. While everybody else was just like trying to live the way. And it's sad, but it was also kind of scary. I mean, like, she's on the run and he's saying he's going to send his dogs after her, and they were going back and forth in public. And I mean, just all the dirty laundry and all the problems that they've been having and all the suppressed violence just kind of came out in that moment. And it was really disturbing to see what was like underneath the whole time.
It was. It was. Well, I know we had said we were going to talk about Wild Wild Country a lot, which I think we have. I want to talk about a few others. But I will mention while we're talking about this that a couple of things that I actually watched this for the first time because it was executive produced by the Duplass brothers, who I'm a big fan of. And I know I've mentioned like Creep and Creep 2 on this podcast a few times. This actually is on Netflix, but it's being sued now. Netflix is being sued. The Duplass brothers and their production company and the directors of the documentary are being sued now actually by the Osho group, because they said that some of the scenes of Bhagwan is their property, and they did not, I guess, give the license to use some of the film. So now that's being sued. And kind of in other news, at the same time, they've announced that Wild Wild Country is now going to be turned into a movie. So there's going to be a fictional account of it with Priyanka Chopra playing Sheila, which, so I guess I don't know how the movie is going to come across. I don't know if it's going to be really focused on Sheila or the group as a whole. But they've talked a lot about the casting of that character, so I wonder if this is not going to be more of a movie about Sheila herself. So anyway, some interesting things happening still around that group right now.
Yeah, it was kind of weird how they ended up in the news at the exact time that we were planning for this episode.
Well, it made it even more. I mean, I knew I wanted to talk about this one because I had really gotten kind of obsessed with it after I watched it, and then yeah, now it's in the news as we're talking about it. So pretty interesting. But Netflix actually has a lot of cult documentaries. So anyone who is interested in any of this, there are a lot out there. Mel, you watched The Source Family, didn't you?
I did. I watched The Source Family, and that's on Amazon Prime right now. And I mean, have you seen it, Lisa?
I have, yeah.
I mean, I recommend it if you're looking for something that's like completely bizarre. I would say the horror of that group came more from from the treatment of women and children, because you're breaking up families, and then like the head of it, James Baker, who was a colorful character, who kind of started out as like his health food store in LA that was beloved by Hollywood acolytes, and turned into this commune, which then became this kind of cultish thing. Father Yod, as he called himself, he would just decide like, well, you're married to this person now, and you're married to this person now. And so some of the women who had left the group talked about how they really had no sexual agency. They were just kind of flitted around wherever Yod wanted. And when he became God, when he decided he was God, I think that was when he had his 13 wives. So there was a lot of issues with the treatment of women there. But otherwise, they started a rock and roll band or like a psychedelic band and released many albums. And he kind of like in Wild Wild Country had fancy cars and clothes and jewelry. And so there was a lot of money going into that as well. So yeah, it was very, very bizarre and very 70s. So I recommend I recommend checking it out. But it's not as like it's not as intense and I guess the threat of violence uh, as Wild Wild Country.
Well, it's what you think Wild Wild Country is going to be when you just learn that there's kind of a 1970s cult. To me, I was expecting the Source Family, and instead I watched Wild Wild Country and got something different. The Source Family was much more really what I expected, of course they're going to be a rock and roll band. Of course this guy thinks he's God. Of course, it was much more of that kind of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and hippie counterculture and cult.
And
That's
health
what
food.
And health food, of course, health food. That was much more what I expected it to be. So I guess depending on what you're looking for, that might help determine whether you want to go towards watching the Source Family or watching Wild Wild Country. And I think this Wild Wild Country does better at getting into like the personalization of it. The Source Family is more voyeuristic in nature.
It is.
If that makes sense.
You're getting their own films and recordings, so you're kind of like you have this weird like bird's eye view into it as it was actually happening. Yeah. I thought it was interesting that it went step by step up to him being God. That was kind of scary. It's like, oh yeah, I was just this guy that was teaching you yoga and how to eat healthful food, and now all of a sudden I become God. So follow my 10 commandments, and yeah, but not quite as dangerous or insidious, I guess, is what we saw on the other one.
Yeah. Matt, have you watched that one?
I have not seen that one, unfortunately, which is why I'm still kind of quiet over here. Don't know how much I could contribute.
Well, I don't know. Are there any more cult documentaries that you guys want to recommend? I mean, I've got a couple of more that I can throw out there as recommendations. But I wasn't sure if y'all had anything else on your list.
Go ahead and give the recommendations.
Yeah.
Might be a good way to kind of wind things up.
All right. Well, I will say this. I'm gonna recommend one right now with an asterisk. And the asterisk is that I have not watched it. But I learned that there's actually a cult documentary on the family, which is based on a book that's out there. I didn't know that either the documentary or the book existed. But the reason I bring this up is in our last mini episode, we were talking about female cult leaders, and just not like the Rajneeshis, where there was a male kind of figurehead who had a woman running the show behind the scenes, but an actual cult led by a woman. And we brought up Anne Hamilton Byrne out of Australia, and how she believed she was basically the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and she adopted all these children and made them the same way. And there was a lot of, I think, abuse that went along with her group. The reason I have not watched it is because after reading a little bit about her group, I just don't know if I could watch it. So I will put that. I'll just say that that's out there. If that's somebody that is at all interesting to you guys, that I believe that one is on Netflix now. But I'm not totally sure. There are a few good ones on Jonestown. I also want to recommend Going Clear, the one on Scientology. That's the one that actually kind of started it for me. Was reading the book Going Clear first, and then watching the documentary about it. It started my interest in kind of cult documentaries. And then I'm curious to hear what you guys think of this one because I wasn't sure to include this one on the list or not, but I'm going to. And that is um, the I Am Not Your Guru about Tony Robbins. I mean, I know it's in the title that he does not consider himself really a cult leader, but after I watched that, I am willing to bet that that is in at least cult adjacent territory. So I don't know. I don't know how you guys feel about Tony Robbins, but I'm going to throw that in the mix.
I'll be honest, I don't know enough about him. I recognize the name, but I honestly don't know enough about him to really weigh in on this.
I mean, so he's basically like a self-help person. You know, he's
Like a
I mean,
life
like a more
coach kind of thing.
yeah, but like a more charismatic Dr. Phil.
Yeah, he does
But
like motivational speaking, right?
he
Like really
does.
intense,
But that's what I
cheerleading kind of
thought.
thing.
Yes, I thought it was just motivational speaking or like life coaching, but after watching the documentary, I don't know, I really started to kind of change my mind about that because and it must come down to just like the people who follow him, the pure devotion that these people have and the way they are willing to hang on his words. And I mean, he hasn't said like I'm God or anything like that, but um more I will say in Teal Swan territory than just like a life coach. That's the way I saw it. So I don't know. It's really interesting um, to watch. So I would be curious. I don't know. Maybe listeners, if you've seen that I Am Not Your Guru, maybe I don't know. Let me know if I'm out in left field on this one, but I kind of feel like he may be a cult leader.
Well, I could definitely see how there could be overlap between someone who's charismatic, like a motivational leader, into a cult. I mean, we talked about the Nexium cult, which was basically a multi-level marketing company that also had a sex cult involved. So, yeah, I mean, not knowing anything about the documentary per se, I could see how it would definitely be at least cult adjacent.
Yeah, we'll leave it there. We'll leave it, right next door, inching over to that. I don't know. But it's interesting. I would recommend it. And I think maybe that's just we'll kind of leave this as final words, but maybe when you're looking at, because we started off this series by asking like what defines a cult, right? Um and I think anytime you have these communities that are following a charismatic leader, you have to kind of ask yourself, is this kind of falling into cult territory? Is this Mel, you used the word groupthink when we were talking about Wild Wild Country, and I think that really characterizes what we've been talking about with all of these groups and what makes it so scary because when it's outside a kind of accepted moral system, you don't know what is guiding that group think. That is scary. So I don't know. Yeah, that I will leave that right there. I Am Not Your Guru, maybe. Going Clear, the family. Um, yeah, go out, learn about some cults.
Well, that's probably the best place for us to go ahead and leave it here. I know that over the last 2 seasons, we've been keeping more to 3-part episodes on any particular topic, but we were talking about it and we actually decided that there's just so much to say about cults, and so much that we have not said, and so much that we want to say, that we'll be doing one more episode on cults. So we're going to end up having a four-parter for this particular series, and so we will see you again in 2 weeks for one last go-round with cults before we move on to our next topic. But before we go, we just want to remind you that we do have a Patreon if you're willing to do some financial support for this show. Yeah, in exchange, you can unlock access to many episodes, and those are available. We release a new one every other week during the off weeks between our main episodes. And we've also would just love to remind you to please rate us, review us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever it is that you found us and are listening to us, because those ratings and reviews actually really do help in terms of just making us more visible and getting us recommended to more people, which is something that we would love to do. So, but as always, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.